Welcome, I'm the Amateur Logician from amateurlogician.com. I hope you are doing well. In a previous video, we talked about different types of truth, semantic truth, epistemological truth, metaphysical truth. Now in this video, we're going to think about being. That is, we're dealing with what can or does exist. And we can divide being in various ways. We can talk about real being, ideal being, and logical being. And there are various subcategories to real being, to ideal being, and logical being. Being is the participle of the verb to be. To be means to exist. We can also think about being as a noun, which means having existence. Now, before we think about different types of real being, like actual versus possible or substantial versus accidental, or before we think about sensible and intellectual ideal being, or negative, privative, or relative logical being, let's take a step back. And we're going to think about metaphysics versus logic. They're two different subjects. Metaphysics, or ontology, is a study of the real order of existing things. It deals with the principles of being qua being. That is, being as being, that all sciences presuppose. And in fact, because they presuppose them, none of these special sciences can prove or even technically disprove principles of metaphysics. We're thinking about the general features of existence itself. And in that sense, being has the narrowest of comprehension and the widest extension. It has the widest extension because we're talking about all that can exist. It has the narrowest comprehension because we're dealing with features or qualities that all being as being have. And those are very, very minimal, it turns out. Now, in logic, we're basically thinking about the conceptual order of thought. So, it's not about existing things per se. Rather, we might say it's about how the mind represents things, or at least that's one conception of traditional scholastic logic. And remember, in logic, one thing we learned is that comprehension deals with the notes or qualities a term has, and extension deals with what it refers to. So it makes sense that metaphysics has the narrowest of comprehension, but the widest of all extension. So with that in mind, let's think about these different classifications of being. We have real being, and real being is anything that has existence or can have existence independent of man's mind or knowing. That is a real being. Now that raises a distinction between actual and possible real being. We have what is actually really present, but we can also have what is possible, that is capable of existence, but doesn't in fact exist presently. So I exist actually. Various qualities or attributes of me exist actually, and some exist possibly. So actually I'm of a certain weight, but possibly I can weigh more or less, for example. Growing in size is possible. It's not absolute nothingness. It's a potentiality, but it's not actual. We then have the extremely important distinction between substantial and accidental, and in other videos we cover this. So in logic, oftentimes when we're thinking about subject-predicate relations in a proposition, the subject is some substance, and then we predicate some accidental feature to that subject. Not always, but often. So to say that Socrates is old, Socrates is the substance. Now, substance exists in itself. It doesn't exist in another. It doesn't inhere in a subject. But an accident exists in a subject. It inheres in a subject. It's a modification of a substance. So the height of Socrates is an accident, but also the age. So if I say Socrates is old, being old is an accidental feature of Socrates, who's a substance. So a substance exists in itself, an accident exists in another. For example, consider motion. Motion is certainly not a substance, it's an accident. Motion is of some substance. It never exists by itself, in itself. Next, let's consider the real being distinction of contingent and necessary. So something that is necessary is something that cannot not exist. Something that is contingent is that which non-existence is possible. But even within necessary beings, we can make a distinction between the absolutely necessary versus the contingently necessary. So for example, water is H2O. The fact that water is H2O is a contingent necessity. It is necessary that water is H2O. If it's not H2O, it's not water, period, end of story. But it's a contingent necessity because water need not be. Water need not exist. Or consider the parents of George or Marianne and Anthony. That's a contingent necessity. I would not be here if it were not for my parents. So it's a necessary fact that those are my parents, but it's still a contingent necessity. On the other hand, what is absolutely necessary is absolutely necessary through and through. So arguably, for example, God is absolutely necessary. He's a necessary being. He is being itself. He is that which sustains the universe. He is the bedrock, the foundation, the absolute, the infinite, in which everything else springs. God is absolutely necessary, not contingently necessary. But that also raises the distinction between the finite versus the infinite. So finite is limited in perfection. The infinite is not. But the infinite, we can make various distinctions. For example, there are mathematical infinities, and there are different types of mathematical infinities. But there's also God, who arguably exists, and is qualitatively infinite. And that type of infinity is quite different than a mathematical infinity, or infinity dealing with quantity, or an infinity dealing with the cardinality or the size of a set in set theory. We have the absolute versus relative. The absolute can exist without reference to another, and we can make various distinctions here. For example, the tree outside in the front yard, that tree I can consider absolutely without necessarily bringing into question other things. Now, it's true it's a contingent being, and it's also true that it's in contingent relations with other things, and it wouldn't exist were it not for the effect of those other things. That's completely true. But we can think about its real being in itself without referencing other things. On the other hand, something that's relative through and through is always referencing something else. For example, parents. So a parent is a real being, but a parent, as a parent, is a relative being to the offspring. It's in a relative relation there. Next, we can consider ideal being versus logical being. They're not the same thing. So if we're thinking about ideal being, we're thinking about intentional being. An ideal being always points to a real being. It presupposes a real being. It's about a real being. Now with ideal being, we're thinking about an object as known as far as it is known. It's a mental being. It's a mental existence. But it's not a logical being, as we shall see in a few minutes. But here the mind is not purely passive. When we learn something new, the mind is engaged and active. We can also make many mistakes. We err often. Our mind is definitely not passive. The ideal being might be defective, so to speak. Now here, traditionally, there's been a distinction between the sensible and the intellectual. The sensible deals with sense perception. It deals with an image. It deals with, for example, so to speak, imagination. The intellectual is about an idea, not an image. So consider a Euclidean triangle. If I have a mental picture of a Euclidean triangle, which is also called a phantasm, it's particular, and necessarily, therefore, it's going to be scalene, isosceles, or equilateral. It's going to be one of those three things. It cannot be all three at once. That's impossible. That's a contradiction, right? But it's going to be one of those things. But the idea as such is not the same thing as the image, because the idea as such is a universal. And as a universal, it embraces being equilateral or scalene or isosceles. Now, the sensible, to some extent, many animals, non-rational animals, can engage in. They can have an imagination. They can have mental images in this sense, in the sense perception sense. They have dreams, for example, and so on and so forth. But they don't arguably have ideas like we do. They don't have intellectual ideas. They don't have a complex language. They don't have universal concepts, ideas. But in any case, an ideal being always presupposes a real being. It's always directed outwardly to the world. That's what an ideal being is. But a logical being is different. A logical being is purely a product of thought. For example, logical concepts like genus or species, logical concepts like subject versus predicate, logical concepts like premises versus conclusion, mathematical concepts like a mathematical matrix, grammar, noun, verb. Those are logical beings. Now, a logical being either will have a foundation in reality or it doesn't. Now, if it doesn't have a foundation in reality, basically it's a contradiction in turn. It's what is called a repugnant concept. A squared circle doesn't have a foundation in reality. To be sure, in some vague sense, I can think about a squared circle, but it has no reality whatsoever. It's an incoherent concept, in fact. It's contradictory. Whereas logical concepts like genus or species has a foundation in reality. Subject-predicate has a foundation in reality. Premise, conclusion has a foundation in reality. Mathematical matrix has a foundation in reality, and so on and so forth. It's not a pure fabrication. Something that doesn't have a foundation in reality is a pure fabrication that is contradictory. Now, if it has a foundation in reality, it could be negative, privative, or relative. So let's think about these three possibilities. If it's negative, it's an absence of being. If it's privative, it represents lack of being. And if it's relative, it deals with relations. But what's the difference between negative and privative? Let's consider an example or two. So if it's negative, it's just the absence of being. For example, lifelessness. But if it's privative, it represents a lack of being. It represents a lack of what should be there. For example, death. There's a distinction between lifelessness and death. If we think about this logically, lifelessness versus death. Privative is a lack of what should be there, or what normally is there in the ordinary course of things, or in the ordinary course of what it means for something to exist. So a living thing, its natural tendency is to try to be alive, right? So death is a privative feature because it's a lack of what should be there in the normal case, versus lifelessness. If I say a rock is lifeless, it's not privative, it's just negative. So we have the distinction between the negative and the privative. What about the relative? Here's a concept about some relation between thoughts. Once again, think about a proposition in logic. There's a subject-predicate relation in logic most of the time. We can make a distinction between the subject and the predicate. The predicate is relative to the subject. The subject, so to speak, is relative to the predicate, in the proposition at least. Or think about the relative nature of premises versus conclusion in an argument. Or think about the relative grammatical features of a sentence in grammar. Or think about all the different relative concepts in mathematics and higher mathematics or high school mathematics. Think about the relative nature of a function and its inverse, if it has an inverse, and so on and so forth. So this is an introduction to being. A being is simply that which is. It is something that has existence or possible existence. And in metaphysics, in scholastic philosophy, we can think about real being. We can think about ideal being. We can think about logical being. We can make all these various subdivisions. And doing so makes us exercise our analytical thinking, even our logical thinking. In any case, I am the amateur logician. Logic is a way to discipline our thinking. When we study logic, we can orderly and rigorously think, reason, and evaluate arguments. Indeed, logic is about good thinking. Now, if you enjoy this type of content, please consider sharing this video with others on social media. Consider sharing my website with others. That would help me out. I would very much appreciate it. It will be a means to help grow this YouTube channel and perhaps get some financial support. You can also visit my website, amateurlogician.com, for the Trivium Logic tutorial, and you can sign up to my newsletter. Thank you for watching, and be well.